If we look at what's going on in the world today, we see so many different things happening at the same time. And it can be very confusing trying to make sense of the debates around these things. But when you actually look at these things holistically, it starts to make some sense. Unfortunately, what we have at the moment is a lot of people in different fields looking at everything in isolation. So you've got one lot of people looking at climate change, one lot of people looking at energy, a bunch of guys looking at food, some other guys looking at the economy, some other guys looking at terrorism and foreign policy. And what I think is really important to do is to look at these things as part of a global system. And when you do that, you actually come away with a different perspective. My view, having looked at a lot of these trends, is that some of the most worrying predictions are most likely to be true. If you look at these things in their totality, what we're seeing is industrial civilization is unsustainable. And all of these different crises are really just different manifestations of the fact that this civilization in its current form cannot survive the 21st century. My name is Nafeez Mosaddeq Ahmed. I'm an international security analyst. I run a think tank in London called the Institute for Policy Research and Development. I specialise in the study of mass violence. I've published extensively on terrorism, imperialism and conflict. And in trying to understand mass violence, I've been looking more deeply at the systemic and structural issues such as climate change, energy depletion, food production, economic crisis, and how these crises interact with one another and how they can also aggravate and radicalise conflicts. I've been trying to understand what is actually going on in each of these crises, trying to get a grip on the debates between experts. So for example, what is climate change and is it real? What is energy depletion? Is it real? How does it work? Well, are these things just something that we're being told? And I've tried to really separate out vested interests from actual data and evidence.
Vision is the most important of the human senses. We learn to see only as we practice using the eyes.
When we're looking at these crises, we're looking at them in isolation. We're unable to see them as parts of a whole. So, to the extent that you have climate scientists looking in a very narrow sense only at our interference with our environment, and looking only, for example, at environmental degradation, they're not able to see the links that that has directly with the structure of our global economy and how that structure, in a way, compels us to go on this path of infinite growth just to survive, just to stop our businesses from failing. They have to continue growing every year. They have to increase their profits. That's just your baseline for survival. So the doctrine of unlimited growth is a failed doctrine. It cannot work. And it's creating absolute disaster. But most of the experts looking at these things are only looking at it from their own lens. So for them, it's an invisible crisis because they don't really see the bigger picture. International terrorism is often viewed as a problem that is either outside Western civilization and competing with it, or internal to communities who happen to be part of Western civilization but are not truly accepting of it and challenging it from within. That's putting it very simplistically, but that's the general sense of the conventional way of approaching terrorism. A quite different picture emerges when you start tracking the financial infrastructure behind actual international terrorist networks. So if you look at most of the Islamist-affiliated terrorist groups linked to Al-Qaeda, there is generally a consistent set of evidence which shows that they are financed by certain groups of states in the Middle East and Central Asia. States like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. One of the other interesting issues that isn't well known is the way in which the West has intersected with this relationship and why the West has done so.
May 29, 1933, after weeks of discussions, there was a meeting at Qasem Palace on the outskirts of Jeddah. It was there that Saudi Arab government officials representing His Majesty signed a concession covering roughly 320,000 square miles. This was the starting point of a new American business venture abroad. But ahead, there was a long, long distance to travel, a huge investment, years of effort, and no end of patience and perseverance.
It's very important that we recognize how significant hydrocarbon energy resources are to the international system. To maintain production, to maintain electricity, to maintain agriculture, we are dependent on certain types of fossil fuel resources.
The problem is that most of these resources are available largely in specific areas of the Middle East and Central Asia.
And historically, for us to have actually maintained control and access to these resources in a cheap way, in an easy way, what we've done is we have teamed up with very, very repressive regimes in these regions. Saudi Arabia being one example, who are willing to supply to us on the terms that we like cheap sources of oil and gas. Part of the process has involved militarily propping up these regimes at any cost. We know for a fact that these regimes are also sponsoring terrorist activities. So there is a clear decision that's been made in the sense that we have continued to maintain ties with these regimes, knowing full well what's going on. The other issue is that not only have we done that, we've actually gone further than that. In order to control hydrocarbon energy resources and to extend that control, we've actually got more involved in the sponsorship of those groups and used them deliberately as mercenary proxy force in order to destabilize certain strategic regions that are either access routes to this kind of energy or actually hold that kind of energy. The policy of using proxy forces has happened in many regions. One of the most obvious examples is in Afghanistan, where we know this happened during the Cold War. The US funded Osama bin Laden and his Mujahideen in order to counter the Soviet Union, the pretext being that we were fighting international communism. The wider context that we are not always familiar with is that Afghanistan has a very important geostrategic position in the international system, and this has been expressed by many experts in geopolitics. One of the most influential is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to President Carter and more recently an unofficial advisor to President Obama. He wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, where he emphasized Afghanistan's relationship to the wider Eurasian continent in terms of an access point, and that maintaining control of Eurasia is instrumental to maintaining US hegemony in general. Brzezinski was also instrumental in kickstarting the policy of funding bin Laden and the Mujahideen in order to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan, whose presence would have undermined US control in the region. But that relationship didn't end in Afghanistan at the end of the Cold War. The conventional opinion is that the US disconnected from bin Laden, he turned against the West, started bombing Western targets, and that this escalated until 9/11, at which point we had to respond in the form of the War on Terror. There are broad areas of that narrative that I might say are correct, but there are fundamental problems with it. And one of the most fundamental problems is that we never really disconnected from Osama bin Laden. This has been corroborated by a number of intelligence experts. One of the most well-known is Sibel Edmonds, who after 9/11 was translating hundreds of pre-9/11 intelligence documents for the FBI. And she has confirmed that Osama bin Laden and the Taliban were sponsored by US intelligence services all the way up to 9/11 at the very least. She was interviewed behind closed doors by the 9/11 Commission, but none of her testimony made it into the public record, and she has been repeatedly gagged by the US government and risks imprisonment for speaking out. What this shows us is that due to our rabid overdependence on fossil fuels, we have become very used to using terrorist groups to destabilize certain strategic regions in order to integrate them into the global political economy and access their valuable resources.
Now that the risks have been taken, now that the pioneering has been done, the way is open for other American companies to come into the Middle East and join in developing its great resources for the benefit of its people and of the world.
The West has been manipulating these groups for very specific geopolitical interests. We know that this was happening with the sponsorship of the Taliban all the way through the 1990s, with the primary interest being that the Taliban would pave the way for sufficient stability to have a trans-Afghan gas pipeline route to Central Asian resources. The envisaged pipeline that would run through Afghanistan was supposed to be a way of accessing largely at that time unexplored reserves of oil and gas in the Caspian Sea. And it would cut across Pakistan, bypass Russia, and it would bypass Iran and transport this gas to Western markets. What we find is that in late 2000, the US government started to have doubts about the Taliban's ability to really pull this off. And this was because the Taliban was fighting a civil war with the Northern Alliance for which there was no end in sight. So from the year 2000 to 2001, the United States government convened a series of meetings and negotiations with the Taliban. The Taliban were basically told, you're not going to have a stable government by yourself. The Northern Alliance is continuing to fight with you. We need you to join up with the Northern Alliance, form a federal government. And if you do that, you'll get all the aid, you'll get international legitimacy, and we can continue with the gas pipeline. And the Taliban, being the hardliners that they were, said, no, thanks. We are the legitimate representative government of Afghanistan, we believe, and we're going to stay where we are. And 3 months before 9/11 was when the last meeting occurred, and the Taliban boycotted this meeting, but they were represented by Pakistani Foreign Minister Niaz Naik, who confirmed that the United States government had proposed to the Taliban that if they didn't comply with this federalization plan, that there would be military action to eliminate the Taliban, and that this action would occur by around mid-October that year, which is exactly when the war in Afghanistan actually occurred. The phrase that was used was that they would get either a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs. And what this shows us is that the war in Afghanistan was not about fighting terrorism. It was not even a direct response to 9/11. It was already being planned. 9/11 just provided the pretext, and it was much more to do with accessing regional resources than anything to do with human rights or fighting terrorism. And now you see with the escalation of the war in Afghanistan, right now US and British forces are trying to expel the Taliban from the southern region of Afghanistan, which is precisely where the Trans-Afghan pipeline is supposed to run.
What we can say with certainty, and I prefer to stick to what we can say with absolute certainty, is that the system generates terrorism as a phenomenon, that terrorism has become integral to the way the system works. And this justifies the state's militarization of foreign policy, and it also justifies the state's increasingly draconian treatment of its own citizens. Overall, we are facing these multiple converging crises.
Climate change, energy, food, the economy, and even terrorism, all of which are escalating.
What's happening in this context is that rather than dealing with the root structural causes of these crises,
which are often rooted in state policies and interstate policies, what you're seeing instead is states are much more able and willing to maximize their military capacity to maintain the structure of an unequal global economic system, often using terrorism as a justification. And we find that a parallel process is happening domestically. Governments are increasingly enacting more and more legislation that encroaches on civil liberties, that allows them to survey communities, monitor people's lives, their ability to control their populations, their ability to counteract the rise of dissident movements.